Most Canadians know the date, 1870, the year Manitoba officially entered Confederation. The point at which Canadian textbooks begin the story, as though history itself appeared suddenly on the prairies like ink drying on the Manitoba Act. But the truth is far older, far deeper, and far more uncomfortable than the tidy version taught in classrooms. Manitoba's story did not begin with the stroke of a pen. It began with the land, with the people, with the cultures that thrived here long before Canada imagined ownership. For thousands of years, the prairies were home to nations whose histories far predate Confederation. The Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Dakota, the Dene, nations with rich governance systems, spiritual traditions, languages, and knowledge so detailed it could not be written in a single book. They understood the land not as property, but as relationship. The rivers, the forests, the plains, the animals, all were part of a delicate balance maintained through ceremony, law, and respect. These were not empty lands waiting for settlement. They were lived landscapes filled with meaning, memory, and continuity. As centuries passed, a new people emerged, the Metis. They were not simply the children of European traders and indigenous women. They became something distinct, something entirely their own. A nation with its own language, Michif, its own flag, proudly carried on buffalo hunts, its own dance, the Red River Jig, its own governance, based on cooperation, consensus, and kinship. The Metis became skilled buffalo hunters, canoe builders, traders, farmers, diplomats, their communities stretching across what is now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, North Dakota, and Montana. They shaped the fur trade economy and became essential intermediaries between Indigenous nations and European newcomers. And yet, despite this rich history, the Metis are often squeezed into a few lines in schoolbooks. The real turning point came with a land deal made far away from the Red River. In offices in London and Ottawa, the Hudson's Bay Company agreed to sell Rupert's land, a massive area of over 3.9 million square kilometers, to the Canadian government. The people living on that land were not consulted. They were not informed. They were not asked what their future should look like. Their homeland was treated as a real estate transaction, a commodity to be acquired. And for the Indigenous Nations and Metis communities, this decision was felt like a tremor before an earthquake. When Canadian surveyors finally arrived, their approach revealed Canada's intentions. They moved across the plains with chains and measuring tools, drawing straight lines on land that had never been divided that way. They ignored the Metis river lot system, long, narrow strips giving each family access to the river, and instead carved everything into rectangular grids designed for incoming settlers. They didn't adapt to the people already living here. They expected the people to adapt to them. It was not just surveying. It was restructuring the land to erase a culture. As fears grew, the Metis organized. They were not rebels, not insurgents, not rioters. They were a nation protecting its home. And among them rose a young leader named Louis Riel. Riel was educated, spiritual, diplomatic, and determined. He understood the gravity of what was unfolding. If the Metis didn't stand up now, their way of life could be erased before it was ever written into law. So they took peaceful, strategic action. They seized Upper Fort Garry, not to attack, but to negotiate. They formed a provisional government and drafted a list of rights outlining what they needed to survive under Canadian authority. Land protections, language rights, religious freedoms, and fair representation. And for a brief moment, Canada listened. The Manitoba Act of 1870 emerged from those negotiations. Textbooks present it as a moment of cooperation, but the deeper story reveals a troubling truth. The Act promised 1.4 million acres of land reserved for the children of Metis families. It promised bilingual institutions. It promised protection for their farms, their culture, and their future. But these promises were fragile and vulnerable to interpretation, delay, and abuse. The ink had barely dried when the betrayal began. The land that was promised did not arrive. Instead of receiving actual plots, many Metis received scrip, coupons that could theoretically be exchanged for land elsewhere. But the process was confusing, full of legal traps and bureaucratic delays. Land speculators with insider knowledge bought scrip cheaply, often from Metis families who had no idea of its value. Many families were pressured, intimidated, or tricked into selling. The result? A massive transfer of land, not into Metis hands, but out of them. And while the Metis waited for justice that never came, settlers poured into Manitoba by the thousands. They built towns, churches, farms, and railways on land that Metis families had lived on for generations. The river lot system was dismantled. New laws were created. New political structures took over. English replaced Michif and French in public life. Cultural respect was replaced with suspicion and hostility. The Metis displacement was not one dramatic event. There was no single day of removal. It happened slowly, quietly, over years. One missed document at a land office. One delayed scrip redemption. One aggressive settler group. One government official ignoring a claim. One family pushed west. Then another, and another, until the heart of the Metis homeland was hollowed out. Students learn the dates, but not the despair. They learn the loss, but not the losses. They learn that the Metis moved west, but not why. They do not learn how close this nation came to losing an entire culture, or how deeply Manitoba's identity was shaped by the people who were pushed out of it. And yet, this story is not over. It continues today in land negotiations, in cultural revival, in legal victories, and in families who still live with the consequences of promises broken over 150 years ago. The legacy of the Manitoba Act is still being debated. The legacy of Riel is still evolving. The Métis nation is still fighting for recognition, resources, and respect. Fights rooted in the betrayals of 1870 and the decades that followed. History is not just what happened. It is what was remembered and what was deliberately forgotten. Manitoba's true story is not a clean narrative. It is layered. It is painful. It is beautiful. It is resilient. And it demands to be told fully. Because some history isn't missing. It isn't forgotten. It was avoided. And now, it's time to bring it into the light. If you'd like to see more untold Canadian history, consider subscribing. Your support helps us bring these stories back to life.